Okay, welcome. This is Charles Leavitt, professor of Romance Languages and Italian Studies, and he's going to be holding forth with me and co-directing this discussion. Charles, would you like to say anything before we get started?
Sure. I thought maybe I'd just say one or make one comment, which was that in reading up a little on this film, I found an Italian press conference that the director Eduardo Ponti and the star and his mother Sophia Loren had given that I found quite fascinating, because they were asked about a particular scene in the film, the scene where she's out on the terrace, and the interviewer noticed, as I noticed as well, and as I suspect many viewers had noticed, that scene seemed quite similar to a scene in a famous Sophia Loren film from 1977, Ettore Scola's A Special Day, Una Giornata Particolare, where Sophia Loren is famously out on the terrace folding her laundry and making a pass at Marcello Mastroianni. And the interviewer asked Sophia Loren, were you intentionally thinking of that scene? Were you remaking that scene in making this film? And she said, no, that's a very old film. I didn't think of it at all. It has nothing to do with this film at all. And her director and her son was given the question next, and he said, actually, that was the scene I had in mind. This was a direct homage to A Special Day of Ettore Scola's, which he said was his favorite film of his mother's and his favorite role that she ever played. And so I thought that was quite striking, the difference there. And I was reflecting a bit on it. There's a kind of, it seems to me, maybe psychodrama you could analyze between mother and son there about, who gets the credit and whose film, right, this is credited to be. I know you said in the introduction that this is clearly a Sophia Loren film. And maybe that's what she was thinking in sort of denying any connection with a previous role of hers, that she wanted it instead to be her son's film. And he instead was trying to give credit to one of her, I think, most famous roles. But there's even more to the psychodrama, it seems to me, because this film, Life Ahead, as you mentioned in the introduction, is a remake. It's the third adaptation of a novel, one adaptation of which, 1977's Madame Rosa, won the Academy Award, and in winning the Academy Award beat out Ettore Scola's A Special Day. And so it seemed to me that perhaps the director Eduardo Ponti was sort of having his revenge in remaking this film and making it an homage to A Special Day. And then two, it seemed to me perhaps that was a way, beyond just that kind of psychodrama, but this making that kind of reference to that film, which is a film set during the fascist period about an unhappy housewife who's trying and I think perhaps failing to live up to some kind of fascist ideal of womanhood, and falls in love with a man who is sort of on the outs with the regime, and at the end of the film is arrested as a subversive and because he's a homosexual. And that then the way that this film takes up alongside that theme of immigration, this question, of Auschwitz, of the Holocaust, and therefore also of fascism, it seemed to me that the film then is in dialogue with not just A Special Day, but with a whole series of Italian films, with decades of Italian films on that topic, and that it's then a kind of, meta-cinematic film in many ways. It's a film that's dialoguing with, that's very clearly cognizant of so many films. Like I mentioned, all those the films on fascism, the films on the Holocaust, but also now decades of films on immigration. So thinking about the film in that context seems to me quite fascinating. But I think beyond that note, I'd be happy to sort of cede the floor and hear from the audience what people made of this.
Charles, thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to hear what you all would like to talk about. I'd love to hear your questions, comments, observations. I'm just going to function as group secretary for a little while and get a sense of what you want to make sure we get around to tonight. So do you have any comments or questions about the film? Yeah, please, go ahead.
Oh, after you, if you want to. Whichever way. I can go first. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I made the same observations about the echoes of a special day in this film. And I think the scene where Madame Rosa and Lola are dancing the tango together, that was another scene that reminded me of una giornata particolare. And I think that says something about also the treatment of gender that's reoccurring through these, and how kind of these societal issues have changed and updated as according to the time period. So I think it was fascinating and beautiful. It's the second time I watched that. But I was also, when Madame Rosa and Momo, they hold hands, it reminded me of the final scene of Senza Pietà. Am I right with a car crash? Is that right? The car crash right at the end, and that you have the close-up of the two hands together. So there's a female character and she's white, and then there's an American GI character and he's black, and their hands are pictured like this. So yeah, just more intertextual references from me.
Yeah. Thanks, Laura.
Couple of things. I was curious about the choice of Elsa Suarez as the singer in that song, who's her own unique, in some ways as important in Brazil as Sophia Loren is in Italy, and as outre, as Ricky had said. So I thought that was an interesting, again, this gesturing. I thought of the cloistering in Finzi Contini's, the openness and then the shutting down. That was similar. But I'm curious, because we were talking about this issue that happens a lot with race, about the kind of white savior and the magical Negro, and that, post Lampedusa, there's been a big influx, though there has been historically, of Africans and North Africans coming there. And I was curious about the power dynamics, particularly from an Italian perspective. Because as an African American, I have my point of view, but I'm curious, since it sounds like Charles has read up on it, how was this received in Italy, other than people like Sophia Loren? Because there's a complicated racial dynamic in Italy right now, and I'm thinking of the senator in the north, the woman who's African, who's been called an animal and a monkey. And so I'm just curious what that part of this immigration story, this multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multi-racial story, how that was received in Italy.
The impression that I have from reading the criticism is that it was received in Italy much as it was received in the United States, which is that the critics said it's a wonderful performance from Sophia Loren in a film that's a bit cliched and trite and oversimplified. And I think that there have been a number of films, I mean, really, again, going back decades, that have, I think, taken on questions of immigration, questions of race, and questions of Italy's, I think it's fair to say transformation from a country of immigrants, of emigrants to one of immigrants, that have done so, I think, with perhaps more depth, I would say, and it seemed to me that the critics in Italy were very much saying the same thing. I mean, it's striking again that what's being adapted here is a decades-old novel, a story that was previously set elsewhere, and that was written at a different time of with different waves of immigration. That I wonder, again, while there's a sort of uplifting message here, I agree with the question of about that sort of white savior narrative that it seems to me this certainly fits into, and that I think perhaps is perhaps saved by the performance of it, but that doesn't, it seems to me, have much to say about that question of immigration, of Lampedusa, of the current racial conflicts in Italy. I think again it was what struck me in rewatching it today was again this sort of, I think, to my mind, rather odd use of the Holocaust in dialogue with that question of race as a way of, it seemed to me of looking at different minority communities in Italy and sort of, using one and the history of one to tell the history of another that I think again fits perhaps a kind of pattern in the Italian cinema. And I'm thinking about a film like Ferdinand Ospitec's La Finestra di Fronte. Is that I think it's The Facing Window, but a film that tells again the story of the persecution of gays under fascism, but uses it to sort of lend additional pathos to a story set in the modern day that I think doesn't map on quite so easily. And there's something I think I find quite awkward in the way that Italian cinema might be doing that and that perhaps Italian culture is doing. That I have to say, I didn't find any of the critics that I read in Italy or in the United States commenting on that aspect. But they did, as I said, all sort of comment on the film as being quite cliche, quite trite. But nevertheless, I think everyone found it, moving because of Sophia Loren's performance.
And the boy too.
Yeah. I think, to speak to your comment about the music, I don't know if you're all aware of this. The film was nominated for one Academy Award.
Yeah.
For Best Song. And so, and in fact, that song I think is interesting, but the fact that it's coming from a Brazilian singer speaks to the kind of international mix that we get here. And I think while this film can be read as a kind of palimpsest of Italian cinema, because there are these references to these other films, not in such an overt way that it in effect undermines the realism of the film or the attempt to kind of give a realistic portrayal. And there is that sense of Italian cinema as a kind of palimpsest here. But there's also a kind of international Netflix style. Which I personally have difficulty with because there's this sense that you've got the Brazilian singer. The rest of the music is composed by Gabriel Yared, all right, who did the music for a lot of the big Miramax movies in the 90s, like The English Patient. Personally, the only thing that I find really trite about this film is the use of the music because it does remind me so much of the Miramax movies of the 90s. And so, this film, in another way, I think what I would love to teach this film at some point would be The Disappearance of My Mother. But The Disappearance of My Mother is the kind of film, the kind of very edgy contemporary film that Netflix is not going to get close to, but was all over this. And so, it seems to me there's one way of reading this in terms of, Italian national cinema and as a kind of historical palimpsest, but then in contemporary film distribution, there is a kind of internationalization here that I think works against the film.
That's a good point. Thank you.
It's interesting, that question about the music too, because it ends with that song, the Laura Pausini song that I think was sold along with the film. There's a music video that Sophia Loren is in that uses clips from the film, but also I think has her acting directly in that music video. That again, I think it might be a way to sell to the domestic market an international film through through an Italian pop star who is who's featured in the closing credits.
Yeah, I was very curious about the use of animation in the movie because it brings together two themes that really struck out to me because of the kind of work I do, which is the religious imagery being mixed with this idea of, facing abandonment in your early days in childhood. And Boy kind of externalizes the lioness and sees it throughout the film. I'm pretty sure, I don't know if it was, there was any animation in the previous iterations of this
I don't think there was.
Rosas. And so I was curious as to what you thought about that particular choice, because does it speak to more of trying to visually depict that abandonment? Because those themes kind of merge into that one, because the lioness keeps coming throughout the movie. And I was curious what you thought about that particular choice.
Charles, what do you think of the lioness?
I have to admit, I only heard parts of the question. I'm curious what you thought, but to me, the lion seemed reminiscent of the computer-generated giraffe in the La Grande Bellezza, the Great Beauty of Sorrentino, where again there was that the kind of magical realism element.
Yeah, I didn't really know, to be honest, I don't know what to do with that Linus, all right? I don't know about the rest of you, but I kept kind of wondering where that was coming from. But this story lends itself, depending on how you want to invest this. What do you think Harold Prince tried to do a musical version of this once upon a time and take it to Broadway. And it just failed miserably, all right? And so I think whether we're pushing it in the direction of a musical or animation and, Lion King-like animals that are suddenly appearing, one of the things I find fascinating about this story, because it has had so many iterations, is how people want to inflect it and, how they want to make it seem significant and what its significance means. I mean, in fact, is that an attempt to sort of take everything up to a more symbolic level and somehow transcend the mortal coil of the film and gesture toward these larger issues? I'm not sure.
I mean, the only thing that was curious to me was because the imagery of the lion in the Quran, as far as I know, veers more towards images of bravery and courage. Like that's what I've heard it as. And using that in that particular direction of patience and like a silent strength of sorts was an interesting choice. I've never seen that being represented on screen in that particular way. So
That's interesting.
And then secondly, just the idea that animation just makes movies cute. Like, that idea that it becomes more Netflix if there's a cute element in it.
Yeah.
I thought it was really interesting how that was brought.
Thank you. I think you had your hand up, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, if one didn't know anything about Sophia Loren, and you were to see this movie, I mean, for me, the performance that was extraordinary was the young boy. And I just want to know what, in a way, it feels a bit like he's being sidelined, and this is about Sophia Loren, and I understand that, but it does feel that this was an extraordinary performance.
Yeah, I kept looking for articles about him, because
Yeah.
very often when a child star is discovered, that's the kind of thing that film critics, a certain kind of film critic goes nuts for. Like, who is this boy? How did they find him? And, is he a natural? Did he ever take acting lessons? That kind of thing. And I wasn't able to find anything, which I thought was, really disappointing, because I think the kid gives an amazing performance.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah. And, yeah.
Well, I agree with everything that was said, because it was very complex, and seeing it for the first time, hard to really put all the pieces together. But I do think there's one thing that we can isolate that was really beautifully done, and it's the psychological picture of, and there I'm thinking of Madame Rosa. The psychological picture of someone who has gone through a terrible, terrible experience where death hung over her head daily, or the experimentation of constant fear. And I do think it's in the writing, and of course it's in the excellent acting. So to isolate that one aspect, I was entranced, because I did think psychologically it showed that this transforms a person. And I don't think those of us who have not been through such a horrible experience, we have to rationally see it. And I do think Madame Rosa portrayed that you are never the same after that.
But both of them did. He had transformation too. I think that's where they come together, because he, in the loss of his mother and the tragedy of his youth, and if you think about it, she says, I had this happen when I was your age, and so she's creating a parallel to say we are really one and the same.
Yeah, definitely, and that's why I think she said, what tragedy are you talking about?
Yeah.
I mean, so there's that sense of, if he has a tragic past, that immediately makes her more interesting. Makes it more interesting to her. Yeah, please go ahead.
I wanted to comment on the lioness. I think the fact that it was brought up is a really good point. I saw it very differently with the role of the lioness. I saw it as more meditative. I saw it as more spiritual, and I saw it in a way to protect the mind, body, and soul in the same way that Madame went to the basement, right? For me, in the same way they went, when he was, helping her, once she got out the hospital, and they had that moment where they was just kind of looking out. It was, those moments were all throughout. And so I wonder if it's harder to see it because with him, because of how race is kind of situated, but that's kind of how I saw it, and I think it was misunderstood because it was particularly in the film, because it was complicated by race.
I think you're right. If anybody want to come speak to that? I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, and that goes a long way toward, asking the other really big questions about this film. I mean, in effect, it is all about defining profound religious and racial differences, which are then somehow accommodated by the narrative and then resolved. And, are those resolutions too pat, all right? And in other words, I mean, on the one hand, part of me wants to say, yeah, it does seem like a very schematic narrative, and that in fact we know these folks are, these characters who have been defined as somehow antagonists are going to come together and they're going to hold hands and everything's going to be great. On the other hand, in fairness to the film, I think it is dealing with people who have had traumatic pasts. And they then try to work out some kind of provisional family. And, they find in each other some kind of, despite the fact they're very prickly on the top layer, there is a kind of empathy that, transcends these kinds of differences. And that formation of the provisional family is one of the things that I think is really interesting about European cinema, and also now world cinema, that when the traditional family breaks down, but then what replaces it? I mean, is it just oblivion, or is it the provisional family that comes together and then meets each other's needs somehow, even in a provisional way? You see what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
And to what you're saying, I think that the prickliness you identify, she had to have as a prostitute that we can't forget. And so she's at one point comes to understand that in him. But to what you've just said, I think one of the things that's interesting that you made me think about, we legitimize that aspect that you identify in her because we have compassion for her age, for her Holocaust positionality. But when one of the first times we meet the lioness with him, it's a mockery. You've woken up the house. You're disturbing our countenance. And you are less than. You're not really, it doesn't have the same valuation because he's subaltern to begin with. And we come to expect it and relish his moments where this happens for him in the way that you said. It's almost like the meditative or the self-care. But it takes us longer to get there because we don't have the signposting that values his position, subject position, as easy as we do to hers. Because we meet him as a thief, we meet him as a miscreant, as somebody who doesn't go to school. So the signposting is all negative to begin with.
Yeah.
Which gives him a very different character arc
Yeah.
then within the narrative. Yeah, that's really an interesting point. Any other comments?
Maybe on that last point, I would just add that I found it striking that they each question that sort of sanctuary element in the other. So she's the one who says, what are you doing? You're waking up the house. And he asks her, what are you doing in the basement? He's the one who says, they say it's your bat cave. That it's as if they're trying to, on the one hand, they're calling into question the mechanisms of the other, but they're also trying to understand them in a way that perhaps others are less, perhaps less openly critical, but perhaps just less curious or less interested.
Yeah, nobody understands them like they understand each other.
Exactly.
Right.
I couldn't get it out fast enough. That's a really good formulation, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. That was good, Charles.
Any other comments? Any final comments from you, Charles? Thank you so much for being part of this tonight. I really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the questions.
All right. Thank you all so much. I hope we see you again for the rest of the series.